The Monmouth Cap. Named after Monmouth, Wales, was a type of hat worn in England between the 15th and 18th centuries, hitting its peak of popularity in the late 16th century. The hat was worn by fishermen, soldiers, laborers, but it was also in vogue with the upper crust. It was a staple of the Englishman's wardrobe, and it spanned class divides. The Monmouth Cap was a practical, bucket-shaped hat. It usually had a toggle or button on top, and it was a great example of early modern knitwear that was functional. I like to knit, so I decided, why not take on a historical knitted project? Why not knit something that had an interesting history, but that wouldn't take up all my time and empty my bank account? This is how I settled on the Monmouth Cap. I found some sources with background information, I collected notes, I even found a pattern, and then I started the process of making one. The first thing to do was secure the... The original Monmouth caps were knitted in a 2-ply worsted yarn made out of Ryland wool, and they were supposed to be thick. It is surprisingly hard to find thick 100% wool yarn. I took a trip to my nearest yarn store, and I picked up my closest approximation to what this Ryland wool might look like. This Barocco Ultra Wool Chunky. It's 100% wool. 100% superwash wool.
Wow.
Monmouth caps are usually red or brown, so I settled on this beautiful orangey red color for mine. Usually the yarn wasn't dyed until after the garment was knitted, but my knowledge of knitting begins and ends with actually knitting, so I didn't try it. The Monmouth cap was felted or fulled, meaning that it had a sort of fuzzy texture. This allowed it to mimic velvet without running afoul of any of the sumptuary laws of the time. Back then, fulling was achieved by, just let me check my notes here, tossing your knitwear into a big machine that hits it with hammers. I figured I could probably do it by hand. The very first thing I did was knit a swatch. I knit up a tiny little square of fabric, I measured the gauge.
I don't know if I love the gauge of this.
And I gave it a bath.
Look how loose this is.
Everything went wrong. The gauge was wrong, the yarn stretched out like crazy, it looked kind of gross. I adjusted my tools based on the bad swatch, and then I got into work on the piece itself. I followed the Mara Riley pattern pretty closely, this time using smaller needles to get the gauge that I actually wanted. Monmouth caps were knit in stockinette stitch in the round, as were most of the hats of the early modern period. The brim of the cap is folded over and joined to make a thicker and presumably warmer band. The rest of the cap was knit in a pattern of even decreases until only the 6 stitches of the tippy little top remained. As I mentioned before, most Monmouth caps had a button on top, but I chose to finish mine with a little loop on top. Some of the historical pictures had toggles or loops instead of buttons, and also I forgot to buy a button. Something I noticed when I was making my swatch was that it was weirdly hard to felt my fabric. I tried to felt it by aggressively sloshing it around in some hot water in my sink. I also Googled it, and someone said to hit it with a potato masher. That does not do anything, okay? That did not help. I have a sneaking suspicion that superwash wool is actually just an acrylic blend, which would make sense as to why it wouldn't felt when I wanted it to felt. Either way, since I didn't have access to Ryland wool, which was beautiful for felting back in its day, I decided to fluff it up by hand by aggressively brushing it with an old hairbrush. Once appropriately fuzzy, I gave it a wash and a dry. The yarn stretched out a bit, and some of its previous structure was lost when I washed it. The hat was originally perfectly fitted to my head, and after I washed it, it was a bit bigger, but it still looked pretty good. I gave it an extra brush once it dried, and my beautiful hat was complete. Monmouth caps were an essential piece of clothing for the working class man. Soldiers, laborers, fishermen, and later slaves in the colonies all wore Monmouth caps to keep them warm while they worked. Part of what makes finding accurate information about these hats hard is they were so ubiquitous they weren't even mentioned much in writing of the time. Some of this is presumably due to Queen Elizabeth I's Cappers Act of the late 16th century, which required everyone to own a wool cap made in England to wear on Sundays and holidays, which meant it was illegal to not have a wool cap. The Monmouth cap itself, though it was associated with poorer classes, was surprisingly expensive at its time. It being fulled in order to look like velvet showed a deep interest in even the working class of being fashionable. Nobody would be fooled into thinking that this ugly little hat was actually made of velvet, especially if you saw it on the head of some poor Welshman. But it didn't stop people from trying to make it seem fancy. Monmouth caps were mass-produced before things were mass-produced. But as we inched closer to the Industrial Revolution, these caps fell by the wayside. It feels almost like a precursor to our modern-day mass production of clothing. There are factories across the world that are manufacturing hundreds and hundreds of basics every day to end up in Walmarts and H&M's and Joe Fresh's? I guess what I'm saying is this is a Joe Fresh toque from $15.99. Is it warm?
It is. It's actually quite comfy.
The Monmouth cap I made is warm. It's fuzzy, it's soft. It's honestly a little ugly, but after the fulling, it's a bit cuter. Even though my little toggle at the top of my hat isn't necessarily meant for anything, I do like it. It lets me pull it off very dramatically. After the 18th century, the Monmouth cap kind of faded out of popular culture, but the fact that it was around for so many years, so many centuries, proves that there was something reliable about it. It's a warm cap, it's useful, it's sturdy, and it is an essential staple to anyone who spends any time outside. When knitting it, you can also understand why it was so ubiquitous and why it lasted so long, because the pattern to make it is so simple. It would be extremely easy to change the size of the piece you're working with to something smaller, something bigger, because it decreases and the techniques that is used to knit it are so simple. When you have a pattern like this, something that can be changed easily, something with a brim that will allow you to roll it up and change its length, why bother changing it? If I had to go outside, the first thing I'd do is grab a hat. And if this were $15.99, that hat would probably be a Monmouth cap. Here. Is it warm? If you were a soldier, would you be warm?
I would be a happy soldier.
Nice. It looks good.
Gonna go get stabbed by Frenchmen or something.
Die of
A cut.
sepsis.
Sepsis. Sepsis.
Beautiful.